This week's Religion Media Centre briefing is on the vote in favour of assisted dying, which came in the Commons on Friday last week by a majority of 55. And it followed years of campaigning and in the end came as little surprise to people because opinion polls had shown a large percentage of the public was in favour of assisted dying. But it is still being churned over by people in organisations who've always been opposed to this, including those from religious groups. And we have a representative group on the call today to discuss the issues involved. And they are Bishop John Sherrington, the lead bishop for life issues in the Catholic Church in England and Wales, Dr. Matthew Daw, Honorary Secretary of the Association of Palliative Care, Dr. Ali Mansour, Senior Lecturer in Islamic Studies at the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK at Cardiff University, the Reverend Professor Douglas Davis, Director of the Centre for Death and Life Studies at the University of Durham, and the Reverend Karen Murphy, a hospice chaplain in Weston-super-Mare. So thank you all very much for joining the panel today. Bishop John, perhaps I can start with you. You were one of the first people to issue a response to the vote when it came last week, and you said it was flawed in principle. I wonder if you could outline briefly your reaction to the fact that it finally passed in the Commons last week.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you for the invitation to join you this afternoon. As a Catholic Church, we've campaigned against this bill for many different reasons. Principle, because of the sanctity of life, and also many of the pragmatic questions that people of other faiths and none have been raising about the legislation. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those details. I thought that, in fact, after a lot of debate, 55 was an indication that there's a lot more questioning about this bill than I might have expected, and a lot of concern about it. So I'm disappointed with the passing and the vote, but I do think there's a lot of ground to enter into and discuss with people, because a number of MPs have said they voted yes to have more discussion, to understand it better. So I think that I would want to engage in an ongoing way in those conversations about the various ways in which the bill is flawed, and in particular, the whole problem of coercion, safety of people, the danger of the slippery slope, but also the way in which people who have conscientious objection, whether they're Catholics or people of other faith or humanists, against the practice of this bill would be protected. And it's not just doctors, because there's many nurses or care assistants in the area of faith who will disagree with this, and often those with lesser voice are not given the same protections. And the other point that is of concern to me is that the Catholic Church has a number of hospices that are open to everybody, free on entry, free on delivery. But how does an institution, whether Catholic or of another faith or none, protect its institutional ethos and say this is not a place, this is a space where we offer palliative care, but we don't offer assisted suicide?
Thank you. We will come into those issues and ask you to discuss them together later. Thank you very much, Bishop. Can we go to Dr. Matthew Daw, Honorary Secretary of the Association of Palliative Care? You took part in a discussion at Farm Street Church before the bill was debated and voted upon, which we reported on. Expressing your misgivings about the bill. You said that you believed it would change the relationship between doctors and patients. And I wonder if I could ask you to just briefly on that. Is that your chief concern from the bill, the impact now on the way that medical care is offered to people?
It's definitely one of them. I wouldn't say it's my chief concern. I listened through 3/4 of the debate on Friday. I guess my chief concern actually is the misconception of what dying looks like. There were many scenarios there which carotid bleed outs or fecal and vomiting and things like that, which I don't recognize really from clinical practice. So there was lots and lots of awful scenarios, and I'm not saying they don't happen, but I think the weighting of the rarity of those events is disproportionate, and also the fact that a lot of assisted dying doesn't solve the problem of those terrible situations. So, for example, the carotid bleed outs, which were mentioned, I think, about 4 or 5 times, there is a risk of sudden events happening with a proportion of our patients, and that risk is there. But unless you are going to say everyone who has that risk and what degree of that risk is going to access assisted dying, then you are, by definition, the vast majority are going to end up ending their life preemptively on something which doesn't happen.
Could I just clarify with you the different messages that are coming out about the extent of pain and suffering at the end of death? Because you're right, it was mentioned many times in the Commons debate, and people were emotional giving their account of how loved ones had died. And yet, at that Farm Street meeting, people involved in palliative care, doctors involved in palliative care and others, said that actually this was quite rare for people to die in extreme suffering and pain. What is the truth?
The truth is, it's extremely rare to die painful and suffering. It depends on the absolute definition of the words you're using. So pain, if you're meaning physical pain, in of itself, dying is not painful. I can say that categorically now. Some illnesses are painful and things like that. If you have an achy back, you're still going to have an achy back in the dying phase. But in terms of the process of dying itself becoming ever increasingly painful, no. If you mean pain as meaning a wider remit of things of what we call total pain, with psychological, social, spiritual aspects to it, and suffering sort of being parallel to that, or distress. Some people can't articulate the distress they're under, and therefore they use the word pain because they can't articulate distress, so they manifest it in the word of pain. And in a way, it is pain, but it's not physical driven, nerve driven pain. It's bigger, and the is it going to solve? We'll call that suffering. No, because that is much wider than that, and it's all the social interacts. It's whether you've got a good family support around you. It's whether you've got a access to all the provisions you need. It's whether you're worried about finances or families or friends coming around. It's much wider than that. And if you look at the statistics in Oregon, I mean the pain, by the way, I think it's 5th or 6th down, and it's not even pain, it's pain or fear of pain is about 30% of people access it. So ones above that are all sort of dignity, or autonomy, burden on family and friends, which is, I think, is 43%. They are much more social, community, this ethos of individual autonomy being the highest principle by which we aspire to. It is those kind of things which actually drive people towards this rather than physical symptoms.
Thank you. We'll pick up some of those details later on, I'm certain. But just to move on to the Reverend Karen Murphy. Karen, you are a chaplain in Western Hospice, Western-super-Mare, and you're a clergy person as well. You're a minister.
Yes, I'm a Methodist minister by background, but I've been a hospice chaplain for 25 years.
We don't really talk about death very much. I'm sure I'm speaking for maybe a lot of people on the call. We've seen one or two friends, some family members perhaps go through the final stages of death, but we're not very experienced in what happens. When you sit with someone who is dying, what happens in that moment? We've been talking to Dr. Matthew Dorr about the pain that's expressed, the distress. What do you see happening at 25 years experience of this?
I think absolutely what Matthew is saying is the existential pain is the one that is sort of hidden and not spoken about quite so much. So my experience has been of sitting with people who I think the language that people struggle to find to say it hurts, the fear hurts, is something that I've just been very conscious of over the years, really, and helping people to face that fear and ask the question, which often people are afraid to ask, is, are you frightened? And if so, what is the fear? What is it? And the fear of being dead is something that I've encountered a great deal, where a patient recently sort of said to me, I feel as if when I die, I've got a picture in my head of stepping through a door, and I walk through the door and I'm in darkness, and there's nothing there and there's no one there, and I'm alone and I'm lost, and that's going to be my existence. Not a particularly religious person, but trying to make sense of just the idea of dying and being dead. So we talked about that and how we might change that narrative and just sort of flip it a bit and think, well, if you have a faith, you may envisage walking through that door and seeing loved ones, being with people who have already gone before you that you want to see again. If people haven't got a faith, sometimes it's helpful to say, what about a place that you've been to where you found peace or joy? And maybe that's where you step into. So it's kind of finding creative ways to help people think about what is unspeakable. The language of death, it's fairly unspeakable, even though we've had quite a lot of high-profile people speak about living with an illness and living with a terminal illness over the past few years. But still, there's a secrecy about it.
How do you think the vote in favour of assisted dying will change your work and the conversations that you require to have?
We had a patient only just recently who has, since his diagnosis about 18 months ago, his fear, his pain has really been driven by a fear of dying. Just that sense of, what's it like? How do I understand at a young age, how do I understand myself to be dying? How can it be? He followed the debate on last week on the television. He insisted on having it on the television. And I said, this is interesting. What are you making of it? He said, well, I think I'd want that. I said, are you sure? He's like, yeah, I think I would. And his family were distraught about it. He said, you'd want to leave us. You'd want to make a decision to end the life that you've got. And so he died at the weekend, and he died, sadly, afraid of dying. We really couldn't find a way of helping him to find some peace. So I feel that our patients, it's on their agenda. The conversations I'm having with patients who are on our hospice caseload, it's very much on their agendas. And some people are saying, well, I think I might. Well, what does that mean? I think as a hospice movement, Hospice UK, our own hospice, the Palliative Association of Palliative Care Chaplains that I'm part of, we take a more quite a neutral stance, I think, but would always be on the side of promoting good, holistic palliative care. That's key to this, really, that people have more knowledge about how we work, the conversations that we can have, and the ways that we work as a joined-up team to address physical, social, spiritual, emotional pain. It's absolutely crucial to this.
Thank you. Moving on to the Reverend Professor Douglas Davis. And Douglas, you've been studying death your entire academic life, and now you're director of the Centre for Death and Life Studies. What's your reaction to the vote in favour of assisted dying? You must have followed the debate for many years as well. Were you surprised or shocked?
I was slightly surprised because I just wasn't sure which way it was going to go. Because parliamentarians are parliamentarians, and the extent to which they represent the people at large is an issue. The key guiding thought in my mind really is tied up with some really good work that one of our Swedish colleagues has done, Per Granqvist, who's written a wonderful book on attachment and religion. And the long and the short of this extremely detailed book is this, that the greater the degree of social welfare in a society, and he's thinking of Western societies largely, the greater the degree of social welfare, the greater the degree of secularization. Now, when you take that in, then that's interesting in relation to what the churches say. And this is where these issues, these emotional issues of trust, and this is why a little while ago I found myself writing about potential NHS betrayal, in this sense that if you trust an institution all your life, from before you were born until you're pretty ancient, and it's looking after you, you trust it. And then that institution says no. It's like that old comedy, computer says no, NHS says no, then you've got a problem. This might be for a very small number of people. But going back to Matthew's point, in a way, and to what Karen's just been saying, we are here in the jungle of emotion and the jungle of logic, which is sometimes invisible in the jungle of emotion, we do not quite see. So these issues of trust, of betrayal, lie at the heart of it. And of course, the big one, fear, that Karen has just been referring to.
I would like to ask you about secularization and the comments that have been made since the vote from Lord Faulkner, who told Shaban Mahmood, when Shaban Mahmood wrote to her constituents and said she referred to her faith, and she said that she wouldn't be voting in favour. And he said cabinet ministers should not impose their faith on others. And then Mark Mardell, who's a BBC broadcaster, now suffering from Parkinson's, said at the weekend that he didn't want people to ram religious ideas down others' throats. Does the vote indicate to you that we are not a Christian society anymore and we are a secular society?
I don't know the answer to that for one reason. The distinction between religious and secular is too complex. None of us speaks without being driven by what lies at our heart. And if an MP has faith at his or her heart, then that's going to be there irrespective of the explicit words. That, I think, is the case. But also, the cultural context in which we all speak is important. I'm thinking now specifically of the Church of England as a national institution. And I'm thinking in particular of the way that safeguarding has become a dominant motif in that church's life. It's in other churches' lives as well, safeguarding. And what I see going on at the moment, in a sense, is, and let me just talk about the Church of England. I did some stuff a little while ago on exorcism in the Church of England. And one of the things you saw there over the centuries was a moving from a big theological enmity with the devil to a kind of pastoral concern with spirits that weren't at ease. That shift to welfare, safeguarding, is not just there with something like exorcism, but is manifest now, I think, in this particular assisted dying scenario. And with one further addition, and that's the Church of England's continuing sense that it's like a parish. It has concern for everybody in it, whether they like it or not. So bringing safeguarding and that parochial sense of overall care sort of come together in a church that perhaps isn't totally secure of what it's up to just at the moment.
So finally, our final guest is Dr. Mansour Ali from the University of Cardiff, and you're a senior lecturer in Islamic studies there. When we've had a meeting about this before, it was before the vote, and one of your colleagues was asked, what is the Muslim approach to assisted dying? And he gave a categorical answer that it was absolutely forbidden in Islam. And if you agree, if that's the case, what does this vote mean then for the medical staff in this country who are Muslims? So apparently 10% of the entire medical workforce are Muslim. 17% of doctors are Muslims. What are they to do, Dr. Ali, in this situation?
Thank you very much. So I've been working on Islamic ethics and organ transplantation now for nearly close to 10 years. And in my kind of studies, I've come across a lot of debates around brain death. And I've also had a lot of Muslim doctors asking me about what they should do when it comes to brain death and when they're asked to switch off the machine, which is basically withdrawing of machine or withdrawal. This is an ethical, moral conundrum for them, in the sense that somebody who's been diagnosed as brain dead or brain stem dead, they're breathing like a living person, they have somatic activities like a living person, they're warm like a living person, and yet clinically they are dead. Is their active involvement of switching off the machine, is it actually killing someone, let alone taking organs from one? So this is a moral conundrum, and a lot of Muslim doctors have asked me about this. As far as assisted dying is concerned, so the switching off the machine, we can basically say that that's withdrawing of treatment. There is a difference of opinion amongst the Muslim scholars as to whether passive euthanasia, if you want to call it, is permissible or not. The majority say it is. What we're talking about is active assistance. From an Islamic point of view, that is a no-go area. So this will come under suicide, and it will basically be completely categorically impermissible. Thankfully, the assisted dying bill has a conscientious no in it, where doctors who do not agree with this law can actually opt out from assisting. So that is a way of helping Muslim doctors. If they have a problem with it, then they can basically opt out of not doing it.
Thank you. Can I pick that up with the other speakers, the impact of this on clinicians, on medical staff? Dr. Matthew Daw, I wonder if I could ask you about that. In your dealings with doctors, what is their response to this?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you the data. Palliative care, pretty very majoritively are against it. Rough numbers are 80% against, 15% neutral, 5% pro, and that's over five surveys of greater than 60% response rate.
They're the people who would be giving the medication, aren't they?
We'll certainly be involved. We get the asked the most. So we get asked, kill me the most, from a terminal diagnosis point of view. There will always be doctors who do this, and that's just numbers, but only 1% to 2% of doctors in Canada actually are involved in it. The conscientious objection within the bill as it stands, I know it's going to committee stage, isn't really that robust, because it is only applicable to actually prescribing or giving the medicines. But as you know, we work in a wide multidisciplinary team in which there is lots and lots of different doctors looking after you in that bed, and different nurses and pharmacists providing the drugs, and so that in true conscientious objection doesn't quite exist in that respect. And also in terms of, at the moment, the bill stands at is requirement that you refer on, effective referral onwards. So you would, if someone asks me, you have to refer. Now, the problem is, because, and this is where I get to where the relationship with doctors and nurses, if you came and asked me, can you end my life? Can you kill me? What degree of exploration am I allowed to do before I'm seen as obstructing onward referral? And now that isn't clarified at all. So if you came and asked me, kill me, and I said, well, no, I'm a palliative care doctor. I want to try and sort out what is it, your pain here, or your vomit, nausea, or what about home situation? Let's sort your will out. Those things can, how long can I do that before I'm actually seen as an element of obstruction to kind of, to access a service which patient or the family feel that they have the right to access. And that is, so it really, really, if I was to pin something very specific down, changes a doctor-patient relationship, it's exactly that. I am suddenly seen as an obstruction rather than a facilitator trying to make them feel better. And what this argument comes down to really is that person's individual autonomy, individual choice versus societal safety. And sometimes you get there's good doctors. Unfortunately, there are bad doctors. But you'll get majoritively good doctors which try and sort things out and no, let's do these things. You get some bad doctors which are just, onward referral, don't have time. And that's probably, I know how busy GPs, I know how busy the wards are over there. I mean, there is it completely changes dynamic. It's not my problem, onward refer. And it doesn't, it will, that's what you want.
Thanks. Can I move to the bishop? Perhaps what you said at the beginning, one of your main concerns was about conscientious objectors, people who are medical practitioners themselves, but also you were talking about organisations, hospices, the whole unit may object. Do you share Dr. Dawes' concerns? Have doctors who are Catholics and opposed to this been in touch with you? Can you give us some idea of the conversations that are taking place?
Thank you. I mean, I share a lot of Dr. Matthews' concerns, and I've spoken with doctors, and a number have made the point about the fact that they work within a multidisciplinary team. It's not simply the doctor and the patient. It's within a team, particularly at the end of life. And therefore, the involvement in a team and exactly where and how a doctor would exercise conscientious objection within that team. Secondly, I'd want to just draw out there, again, the language in the bill is to refer to, hand on to somebody, and there would be doctors who would not want to do that. They'd want to withdraw and allow someone else to then take charge. So it's a more distant method of referral, which I understand is possible in the area of abortion today. And then you've got the question of the team, all the others who are in some way involved, and maybe after the drug cocktail has been taken, if the person doesn't die immediately, then there may be people, nurses, etc., with them. I'm not the medical expert, but it does seem that the law is phrasing it in a very individual one-to-one way, and actually the complexity of medicine is more difficult. But others could answer that better. In terms of institutions, how does our society create a space where there are institutions of care which have a particular ethic and are able to preserve them? So that, in fact, if you went to this particular hospice, which could have a faith background, then assisted dying is not offered there. How is that to be preserved within the legislation? And there is a point in the bill, and again, this is for the legal experts to interpret, saying that if there's a doctor employed by an organisation and he wishes to raise assisted suicide with a patient, then there can be nothing done detrimental to his employment. Well, that could go against the ethos of an institution of care where assisted suicide is not permitted. So I think the question is, what sort of society do we want to create, and how do we preserve spaces within that society which are able to deliver palliative care and be free from the implications of a law on assisted suicide?
Do you fear that now the bill has been passed, that those protected spaces may not be allowed to exist, or there will be pressure for them not to exist? What do you fear?
My fear is that there won't be time for adequate discussion of these points, because the private members bill remains a private members bill and has very limited time for discussion. So I hope that in the committee stage now, all these questions and the voices of the professional bodies, such as the Catholic Medical Association, will be heard, the Anscombe Centre of Bioethics, that there will be a place in the committee stage for these voices to be heard, and therefore refinements to be made before the third reading. And obviously, there'll then be the debate in the House of Lords. But my concern is the timing, and I don't know enough about the legislative process about the amount of time given to committee for a private member's bill, and then similarly in the Lords. So I do have fears that it will remain unchanged, and that many clinicians, many medics will fear, and nurses, care workers particularly, will find themselves in a very difficult position afterwards.
Right. Look, can I move to Karen Murphy? Because you're working with nurses and medical staff all the time. Can you just explain to us your views, your fears, your concerns about how this will work out in practice on the ground in a hospice?
I think the issue is that hospices, are a public persona. People have an idea of what a hospice is, and a lot of people already see it as a place where you go in and you don't come out, that they are places where death happens, which of course they are. But also the fact is that hospices offer symptom control, help for people whose symptoms are not controllable at home or necessarily in hospital. So our specialist care is sort of phenomenal, really. So we've tried hard, I think, over past 20 years at least, to improve what people's perception of a hospice is, and to change that mantra that it is only a place where people go to die. And our nurses, our doctors are sort of passionate about that as well, so that the way we talk about what we do and how we do it. So it's so important just to keep people's confidence that if they are admitted to a hospice, they are going to get good holistic care, good palliative care, which may mean that their symptoms are well controlled and they're able to return home and live, as Cicely Saunders says, live as well as they can for as long as they can.
Right.
So I think that's what we're hearing, that's what we're discussing among ourselves.
Thank you. Picking up another point then, we've talked about conscientious objection. Can we talk about the increase in palliative care, which several of you on the panel have said is an important discussion that took place as part of the debate last Friday, the need for better palliative care. Can I go to you, Dr. Mansour Ali, on this? Do you hope that the discussion of the bill will have this spin-off effect, if you like, the side effect of introducing better and more extensive palliative care? And how confident are you that will happen?
There have been arguments made that this bill will help improve palliative care. For the life of me, forgive the pun, I don't know how the bill will improve palliative care. The NHS is, kind of falling breaking from the seams. I think rather than spending a lot of money and this new law, which is going to come in finally, will have a lot of commercialized aspects to it. Rather than spending all of that money, more money should be spent in palliative care, and especially dealing with what Dr. Matthew mentioned about these existential problems, rather than nerve pains, psychological, social problems. I mean, from an Islamic perspective, pain is basically seen as a redemption. We find in the prophetic tradition that even if a person is pricked by a thorn, then that is penance for their sins. So from that point of view, where in Islam, like Christianity and Judaism, sees this life is only transitional and there's a wider life to come, then the meager pain in this world is quite pithy compared to eternal bliss. This is how a Muslim will kind of do their own kind of spiritual palliative care.
Do you really mean that suffering is caused by something that you've done that was wrong?
No. I don't mean that. What I basically mean by that is that if somebody has done something wrong, suffering in this world is a redemption for that wrong. In the sense that it is forgiveness of that sin. So this is the way that Muslims kind of deal with this question of moral evils. That if somebody has a kind of a disability or some pain, then this is a forgiveness for something that they have done wrong, and God will reward them for that in the hereafter. I just wanted to pick up on one thing that one of the speakers mentioned previously about the relationship between doctors and patients. There is a theory in economics called the moral hazard theory. And the moral hazard theory suggests that if we have a certain kind of insurance, then we tend to act more recklessly. So, for example, now that we have seat belts, people might feel that they are safe and therefore drive a bit more recklessly. If somebody has got a house insurance, then they might not take the full care of securing their house because they think all the insurance will pay for it. So this is a psychological perspective. So here, if we bring in this bill, the assisted dying bill, what may happen is that there might be an assumption that, oh well, we don't need to take a lot of care of this patient because this patient might want to die. So I just wanted to bring that aspect in, that it changes the entire dynamic between the patient and the doctor and how care is seen.
Thank you. Briefly, Bishop, I wonder if you want to respond. We've heard the Islamic idea of suffering, and I wonder if you'd like to give some kind of notion of the Christian understanding of suffering.
I think, first of all, that very similarly to Dr. Mazur, there is an understanding that the suffering that a person experiences because of the breakdown of their body or because of evils done can be offered to Christ. And in that sense, it can be redemptive. Christ has redeemed the world, but suffering still occurs, and one can offer one's suffering to Christ. And that can actually give the person suffering a great sense of hope, that in some way Christ is with them in their suffering, they're participating in the cross, that in some mysterious way their suffering offered to Christ does bring healing in the wounds of the world and the church. And this is certainly expressed by great saints like St. Therese of Lisieux, who suffered from a very painful terminal illness and offered her suffering to Christ as an act of love for the church. I think the difficulty in talking about this is how you approach this pastorally with people. To jump into talking about redemptive suffering when a person is in a state of crisis about their suffering isn't pastorally right. But there can be ways in which people come to this deeper understanding in the same way that they move through denial or anger into an acceptance of perhaps terminal illness, and then see a way in which, because of their faith, they could offer their suffering to Christ. But it requires that pastoral accompaniment of a person who is suffering, and it taps in with that that understanding that Matthew mentioned of the total pain which causes suffering, and therefore this can be spiritually assisting them. And I do see the parallels here between Islam and Christianity, which is very helpful.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask you another question and bring Douglas in afterwards, because I know, Douglas, you have to go shortly. But Bishop, can I ask you whether you feel a sense of disappointment or even rejection that despite the fact that all the main religious leaders spoke against this bill, it was still passed by MPs? Does it indicate to you that the voice of religious leaders is now ignored in our society, which is largely secular?
I think you cannot jump to that conclusion when you recognize the vote. It's not possible to judge unless you statistically analyze how any religious leader has influenced the people who have written to their MPs or influenced the MPs themselves. It's just too complicated. But what I think this process has shown, in fact, is a very important place for religious dialogue in society. Just before the vote, there was a joint statement of faith leaders that was Catholic, Anglican, Jewish, and Muslim, and there was a concern expressed together. That was very positive religious dialogue. And similarly, the voices of leaders of faith communities have been significant in shaping, helping people to form their conscience in order to motivate themselves to write to their MPs, who have had to then discern what they vote according to their own conscience and what they have heard from their constituents. So I think it's been very influential.
How do you understand the way that people who don't have a faith or a background in religion use their conscience to vote in a certain way? I mean, with religion, you have your scripture, tradition, you have your leaders, your priests who help you come to a conclusion. On what basis do you think those ideas are formed for people without faith?
I think it's formed through human reasoning. I mean, when we make a judgment in our conscience, which is shaped by faith and revelation, it's shaped by scripture and tradition, it's listening to the voices of authority in the church, but ultimately, a person has to make their judgment out of their reasoning on the particular situation. I know humanists who are opposed to assisted suicide, and out of their reasoning and their understanding of the dignity of the person, they will argue against it. So one mustn't underestimate the capacity of human reasoning in this area. A point was made earlier, I think, by Douglas about the jungle of emotion. And this is a highly emotive discussion and debate. But that's why it's important to stand back and reflect and reason about the societal consequences of this particular legislation.
Thank you. Douglas, just to respond to what the Bishop said there about the way that the vote was conducted, and to pick up the earlier point that we discussed about whether, as one bishop has said, in fact, Britain is no longer a Christian country. I mean, you're a professor, but you're also a reverend in the Church of England. Do you think we're a Christian country anymore?
I think we are mixed. I think we are completely mixed. And what is really important is often there's kind of a pyramid of influence in Britain. And sometimes at the top of the pyramid, influence tens, 20s, hundreds of people below them. And that's why MPs, clergy, and others, atheist leaders, are really important. I'm very interested in how our lifestyle influences our death style. And it seems to me that the way many people, I think that people are influenced much less by reason than by life experience. What happens in their family. I think those of us who are much involved in theology, and this might be true for Bishop John as well, we think of reason, we think highly of reason, of logic and rationality. But in everyday life, our guts influence much more than our cerebral hemispheres might. So we've always got this problem of thinking about things, but then relating to the emotions of things. I think that at the moment we're in this time of change, and for the churches and other religions, it's putting us on our theological mettle. Let me explain. 1,500 odd years ago, St. Augustine was asking himself the question about a group of young women who preferred to commit suicide than to be violated by non-Christians. And he asked himself the question about this. What was he to think about this group committing suicide rather than being raped, really? And his answer was amazing. He said, I do not know what was in their minds before God. And I think that's radically interesting, giving credence to others and the way they live and the way they wish to die. My final point, I suppose, would be this, that times influence our thoughts, and this time of change should influence all our thoughts. In the next April, we're putting on a conference here on Durham on the concept of closure. And I'm expecting to get medics, psychologists, musicians, literary people coming together, because this issue of assisted dying raises the question, this vexed question of closure as a valuable or as an absolutely stupid concept. And whether in a secular sort of context or a religious sort of context, how we approach closure seems to me to be the catalyst for our thinking about what the churches should be up to in getting real. I mean, wake up and smell the coffee is a kind of message both to MPs, to church leaders, and indeed to the public at large.
Thank you, Douglas. We're drawing to a close now, so I wonder if I could ask you for some final comments. Matthew Dorr.
Listening to all that, that's really interesting stuff. Can I do make three observations? The first regarding palliative care, that came up. Palliative care is predominantly charitably funded. It's 37% funded by government. That's decreased. Does assisted dying debate help palliative care? Well, no. In actuality, it's shrunk it already. National insurance has in the budget has shrunk. The hospice sector shrunk. The GP sector shrunk the care home sector. And although there's a commission being announced on it, that commission is not led by government. They can ignore it. 114 times palliative care was mentioned in the debate, someone told me. I am very skeptical. I think they were words, and I'm saddened that palliative care would not got even remotely as much attention if it was put as a private men's bill. That's one. What message are we sending? That palliative care is charity, while assisted dying is potentially state. Suffering, with a lot of discussion about suffering. I've spent my life trying to treat suffering, but treating suffering is not removing the sufferer. They are different things. So if you've got I've got a radiator over there. If I got a leaky radiator, removing all the plumbing does not solve treat the radiator, does it? It is removing the ability for the radiator to be a radiator. You're removing the ability of that person to exist, to treat their suffering, rather than treating the suffering. And that distinction is blurred in the assisted dying debate. Jurisdictions which have assisted dying, do you think they have any less suffering? No, they don't. You are foreshortening life. A religion, I do get a bit frustrated with the religious debate, namely because I think two things. One side is that humans we're far more similar than we are different, and we all have a conscience, and we all live by certain hierarchy of those things. I get frustrated with the Humanist UK saying that everyone is driven by religious ideology. That is simply not true. I also say, well, Humanist UK, you are also driven by an ideology here. And why do they have a absolute memorandum on being the only rational people? We're in a whole society altogether. And therefore, I think the argument comes down to my last point, which is the balance between individual autonomy, individual liberty versus societal safety. And the best way I can explain that is one last analogy is the gun lobby in America. So gun lobby in America, NRA, all that, it's my right, my choice to carry a gun. And there is societal consequences to that, to having a lethal weapon in the house. There's more murders, more suicides, more accidental deaths, very statistically proven. If we introduce lethal medications into the house, there is going to be, I would suggest, the same societal consequences. And the decision society has to come to is whether the right to have assisted dying, the choice to have assisted dying, is enough that we accept a degree of those incorrect deaths through those consequences, and where is that percentage? And my thought is that percentage is far too high, because I know, as I said, 43% of the population feel a burden on family and friends.
Right. Thanks, Matthew. We do have Kieran from Humanist UK on the call. This is the point to bring you in, Kieran. If you would like to respond to what Matthew's just said.
Sure. Just to make the point that I'm very new to the Humanist, and I think it's been a really respectful chat. I think I would like to the point that was just made, to echo the Bishop John Sherrington, who quite rightfully said that human rationality between humanists and non-believers also varies, and that there are humanists who do not support the assisted dying bill, as there are indeed Catholics and other Christians, and indeed Muslims and Jewish people who do support the assisted dying bill. I won't speak for the entire organization being so new on that, but I would back that point. I think, one of the few things I can say, and not to kind of use polling as an essentialist authority, but I do, I suppose I find it interesting in the discussion today that kind of, especially around the question of whether we're a Christian country, kind of reflects the fact that a majority of British citizens, including, at least in polling, a majority of those who identify as Christians, do support the assisted dying bill. So it's an interesting question there of, if it were purely reflecting numbers, and percentages from polling, which of course we couldn't expect it to do, Parliament is actually, the vote is actually underrepresentative of the British people in terms of a 63% or thereabouts support, and only 55% of MPs supported this bill. That may be to do with the practicalities of the bill. I'm not saying that they are one-to-one, but I do think there's an interesting question on conscientious objection from one side to, I suppose something that came up in the question of pain and suffering on my side of, for those of us who don't believe in pain as redemptive or something that can be offered up to Christ, as seeing pain at the end of life sometimes as, simply kind of a meaningless and very traumatic and unnecessary part of the dying process. Where do we, how do we balance those who conscientiously object to those around us who see it as valuable? How do we live in a society? I think the question by Bishop John Sherrington is the right question of what is the kind of society, and how do we balance those who do have different perspectives on dying, and how do we respect one another in that space?
Thank you. Let's leave the last word then with Bishop John Sherrington. What kind of society is it that we want to live in?
I think, first of all, the point was made early on in the debate about the fear of death. And we actually have to develop a literacy about death, that people are freer to talk about it. And the fear that was expressed perhaps of a person who's dying, it may be the fear of the family who don't want to raise the fact that they know their mother, their father is dying. And she may know that, but they don't want to raise it. So the relationships become very difficult around the bed. So how we develop a greater literacy about death, and I understand death cafes have contributed to that, where people go and talk about death. So that's one aspect of sort of society we want. I think we've touched very deeply into the question of suffering, and can you find meaning in suffering? And there's different views being expressed, and that's again is it's the question that's been asked throughout a whole century, all the centuries. But again, how do we enter into that in a deeper way as a discussion point in our society today? And it doesn't only affect dying through illness, but when we look at the suffering of war or the suffering of injury and all sorts of things. And finally, I think the sort of society we want to create is precisely where within the public space, people of different views can debate and bring their experience and talk about these things. Sometimes a debate becomes so polarized, there's no real progress. But I was very struck by the silence at the end of the parliamentary debate, and when the vote was announced, there was a respectful silence, recognizing that a profound discussion had taken place with people of different views, but they did listen to one another. So that's the sort of society I would like.
Thank you. And thank you to all our panelists for your contribution today. And I hope you'll join us again for the next briefing.